Hey everyone, how are you doing? Welcome to today's live stream. It's been a while since I've done a live stream, but I'm really happy to be back. Before we start, I have a very important question to ask you. It's almost Easter. So my question is, what is your favorite Easter egg? Is it milk chocolate, blue? Is it white chocolate, or is it pure chocolate? Wait, I'm gonna post a poll. There we go. So let me know. This is very important information for me because I'm going to come out, of course, with ArjanCodes Easter egg. So I need to know the percentages of milk chocolate versus white chocolate versus pure chocolate. And it's really important because otherwise, yeah, I have no idea how to sort those things. So let's see how this is going. We have milk chocolate 54%. That's going pretty well. Ooh, pure chocolate is getting close to the milk chocolate. White chocolate is really behind. Apparently very few people are in favor of white chocolate. Hard boiled, says Michael Jordan. Yeah, I think they're not boiled at all, these eggs that I used. Yeah. So let's see. I think it's almost a wash between milk and pure. Exciting. My favorite one is actually this one, pure. I can't stop eating them. I have to be really careful. I try to not buy them. I bought some more or less so that I could just show them in this live stream, but I really try to not eat them. They're very dangerous. All right, well, that's good to know. Okay, so if I release ArjanCodes Easter eggs, that means 50% need to be milk chocolate, 40% pure, and I'll throw in a few white chocolate ones, just, you know, for those 13% of people that still like those. Good, 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 good. So, related question, if we're talking about Easter eggs, have you ever put an Easter egg in your code? Have you ever done that? Have you written code and included an Easter egg? And did somebody find out that you did? When I was doing my PhD studies, I did that in Geneva. I was part of a research group where we did work on computer graphics and chatbots, not like ChatGPT. It was really like question answer pairs with a couple of conditions and pattern recognition, basically really basic. Actually, I added in a part where I made the chatbot started making all kind of stupid jokes about my boss. But I think until this day, actually nobody actually found out that I did that because, well, I was not fired and I never heard anybody about it. So I think I got away with it pretty nicely. So let's see, who do we have here? So we have people from Rotterdam, nice. We have Morocco, Mohamed, great that you're here. Sweden, India, awesome, very nice. So I'm going to answer a couple of your questions tonight about software design, software architecture, Python. Any question you'd like to ask me, just post it in the chat and I'll try to answer as many as possible. Before we start with that, I have a small announcement. So a couple of weeks ago, I did a poll on my YouTube channel about what kind of course I should develop next. And about 60% of you voted for the course on software architecture. So I've decided to move ahead with that. And this is actually the link if you want to find out more, if you want to be updated on what's happening related to that course, you can go there. You can pre-register for free. I have some pretty, I think, a really cool idea that I haven't seen really in other courses that I think you're really going to like. And I'm also going to do something special for the first group who joins. So if you want to keep up to date, see what the progress is, go to arjan.code/architect, put in your email address. I won't send you spam. It's really just to keep you updated on what's happening. All right. Now I'm going to go through a couple of your questions to get started. So the poll, I think I'm going to end because that's pretty clear what the direction is going. Thanks for replying, by the way. So at the top, I see Magda. Welcome to ArjanCodes. You're a member now. That's great. Thank you so much for your support. I also see quite a few questions by Sonny. So I'm just going to start by answering one question. And then if I have time, I'm going to try and get back to your other questions as well, so that everybody gets an opportunity to ask a question. So your first question. Hi, Arjan. If you are starting out your career again, what would be your thinking framework for evaluating whether or not you should pursue graduate school? Yeah, so I think I've said this in past live streams and maybe even in some of my regular videos as well, that I'm kind of on the fence on how useful education is if you really want to become a software developer. I mean, up until some level, it is definitely useful. You need to know the basics of computer science, programming, some mathematics. I mean, knowing those tools is really helpful. But I do think that a lot of the, let's say, master program, PhD programs, postgraduate things are, I'm not sure they're really that helpful, if I'm totally honest. For me, what helped me the most in become better at software development is just really develop like loads and loads of software and getting in the practical skills and trying different things, working with people on code and seeing what goes wrong and how you can learn from that. And for me, that was a way more helpful way of becoming better at coding. I think if I look at my own career, I spent, until 2016 at the universities, mostly teaching. I mean, I was also doing research, and for research I was doing a lot of coding, but these were relatively small scale projects. And also they didn't really focus on quality of code. It was more about getting something to work and making sure that you can actually run your tests so that you can write your paper, which was the end goal. The end goal was not writing software. The end goal was writing papers. And that means you have a different approach to how you write your software. I still think that even if you're a researcher, you should still, also make sure that your code is actually easy to understand and easy to test, because you want to make sure that your results that you get are actually true and that there's not all sorts of mistakes in them. So until 2016, I basically did mostly research teaching, not really that much experience really leading software development teams, building bigger projects, products, things like that. But I learned a lot. I think I learned about like 10 times as much as soon as I started my own company. Started making loads of mistakes, developing bad products, making the wrong choices. And that really helped me learn so much. And I think for me, the past 5 to 6 years have been really incredible in terms of how much I've learned. So the years that I've been studying have been a good basis, but I don't think that brings you the most knowledge, basically. I really think it's getting the practical experience in is what counts the most. So, okay. I see you have a second question. What's your advice for finding a job with strong mentorship opportunities? How can you successfully procure mentorship, code reviews outside of work? Yeah, so, I mean, you could try to look for somebody that you can pay to mentor you. I think there are a few platforms that offer possibilities for that. But again, if you look at it from, let's say, the practical point of view of how you learn the most, it's really about getting that practical knowledge in and doing the thing. And I'd say the most important way to do that is by contributing to open source projects. And there's a ton of them out there. You can certainly find some projects that are really you're interested in, that align with your skills in terms of complexity and in terms of the type of application that you're developing. I think that would be a great start, to be honest. See, Paul asks a similar question. What's the best way to get started with open source Python projects in terms of finding the right project to work on and the best way to get involved? So often what happens is that in an open source project, it's something that you're using, and then you notice that something's broken, or you would like to have some sort of feature that you're missing. And then at that point, you start working on that feature and create a pull request, and that's how you sort of roll into it. So I wouldn't explicitly pick something, but I would really look at the libraries that you're already using and see if you can contribute something, something that you've learned from using these libraries. I think that's the best way to get started. Okay, other question. Sonny asks, you'd like to know how to name elements of your modular systems. Wrapper, node, element, manager, handler, frame. How can you get better at naming? Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of these words, like you're mentioning a few of them, but also things like service or manager, like what you're saying. These are typically kind of hard things to put into your code. Managers are often almost singleton-like style things, which is generally not so good. Nodes are typically something that are connected, so you would have a graph with nodes. So I guess depending on what kind of thing it is, you pick the right name for it. Manager is, that's typically a name I try to avoid. Basically, if you have managers, it means you have singleton-like things that you need to initialize, and that typically doesn't work that well. I would also look at how other frameworks do it and pick names that match with the framework that you're using. I mean, Django is also going to use these kind of terms in, and if you're in architecture and they're using, for example, MVC, then you're going to have models, views, and controllers. So depending on the framework, depending on the architecture, you can pick names that fit well within that. Let's see. I see that. Oh yeah. Okay. Amuya is implementing Poetry, one of your projects right now. Very nice, very good. I'm also using it more and more. Actually, I've started to include Poetry, at least PyProject files, for all of my code examples now. So if you look at the Git repositories of the most recent ones, you'll see that there's now a PyProject file that contains the Python version and the dependencies. I think that's already a lot better than what was there before. And I use it now actually also for most of my code examples. I really like using that. Blackrobe asks, got a recommendation for a Git repository folder structure for a REST API. Yeah, so typically I'd say the folder structure follows the, let's say, the endpoints of the REST API. So you would have, if let's say you have a, I don't know, hotel booking system, you're going to have rooms and customers and bookings and other things, and those will typically be folders within your REST structure. And then within those folders, you would have modules to handle those specific things. Other things you will probably have is that you should follow some sort of architecture to separate the router part of your REST API. So the part of the system that decides how the endpoints look like from the actual operations that your REST API is doing. So that could be interacting with the database, for example. So typically you will also have a folder containing operations, and those things will be further split into the different parts of the system that your REST API controls. So that way you can test the routes in an API separately from the operations on the database. And that's really helpful. Pacers Go asks, I'm wondering, do you hire a designer to design your app or just ask the front-end engineer to do the job? So I'd say that that is actually something that has changed over the past years. So I'd say 10 years ago, it would be really typical that you would hire a designer to do all of that work for you and really design the interactions and things like that. But similar to what's happening with websites, where most websites are basically more or less one-page apps that all look kind of the same, you also see the same with platforms, the same with software and how the user interface looks like. You typically have a menu on the left, and you have like one primary color and things like that. And if you use a design system like Material UI, for example, then by default your application already looks good. So you wouldn't really need a designer for the app part. You might need a designer for your website so that everything looks smooth and everything looks attractive. But for your app, I don't think you need a designer for that. What is really more important is somebody that thinks about the user experience. And depending on whether you have those skills yourself or whether that's something that you don't feel that comfortable with, you might want to hire somebody for that. Because in the end, that's all that matters, the user experience. So and you can actually get quite far ahead by learning about that yourself, because there is also standards and rules and things you can do in order to get a decent user experience. And finally, it also depends on in which stage you are as a product. So are you just launching something? In that case, you want to keep it as simple as possible. You just want it to do the job and you don't really worry about design. Or are you really an established product where you're really just doing final tweaks, but basically everything is there and you just want to make it shine a bit more, look nicer? Well, then it might make sense to hire a designer to do that. Alex, hi from France. Bonsoir. Okay. Yogas asks how to switch from QA automation to a developer role. What should be the ideal mindset one should have? Well, I'm not an automation expert, but I can imagine that if you're building automations, then you're really more focused on very specific, smaller scale things like connecting two systems and building a script for that. And so it's going to be a lot less, let's say, large scale than becoming a software developer. So I think the most important part for you to learn, because you will know already programming and how the basic syntax of languages like Python work. I think the most important thing to focus on is the whole design aspect and making sure that you're able to create more complex applications. So learn about solid design principles, learn about some basic architecture so that you know if you create, for example, a GUI application, that you know how to set that up, and learn about software testing. You might also have already tested your automations. I'm not 100% sure of that, but software testing is a really crucial part of software engineering that you should also focus on. Konstantin asks how to design a database schema, SQL, better to avoid blocking by concurrent processes which make write-update requests frequently. So the standard way that you would do that is not so much designing a different schema, but working more on with a transaction model. So with databases, you can basically use them in such a way that when you do a sequence of operations, that you start and end transactions, and then within the transaction, the operations are atomic. Now you could think about analyzing how those processes are writing requests to your database. And it's possible that you can, similar to what you do with decoupling software, is that you can decouple your database schema a bit more and use smaller tables instead of a large table that contains everything. And by doing that, you can sort of split the write operations, because they don't need to all operate on the same table at once, but some are going to operate on a smaller part of the table and others are on another part in that case. But you also have to be careful that you're not turning your database into a huge mess of tiny tables everywhere, just because you want to optimize concurrent writing. In that case, it's better to just pay a bit more money and get a faster database. All right, Nicolas, based in Portugal. I mainly worked with functional programming, data science, and have been watching videos to get around object-oriented programming. Yet I still struggle to see how I can apply it. Yeah, so actually I recorded a video about that last week, where I'm going to talk about, it's coming out in a few weeks, where I'm going to talk about functions, when you should use functions and when you should use classes. But the gist of the video, now I'm already spoiling it for you, still watch it though. The gist of the video is that functions are really action-oriented. So they're really focused on the flow of information. Like a function gets arguments, does something with those arguments, and then returns a result. And classes are more state-focused, so they focus more on structuring information, right? You have variables that are grouped into objects. Objects themselves can be part of other objects. You get a whole hierarchy that way. And so if your code is action-focused, then functions make way more sense. If it's state-focused, then classes make way more sense. And typically, if you're looking at data analysis, that's very much action-focused. It's very much about data flowing through processes and data being manipulated and converted and exported. So I think classes themselves in a lot of data analysis applications have a really limited applicability. Though you will probably use them in slightly different ways. For example, if you use something like, I don't know, pandas, well, it has a data frame and it has series. Well, those are actually classes, right? Or if you're using Pydantic for data validation, then you have to create a base model subclass or a data class kind of structure so that you can apply those validation rules. So then you're also using classes. So you don't always have to use classes as part of like big, huge systems. They just show up in bits and pieces of your code. Even enumerated type in Python, use a class for that. That's the same idea. Ben says, in my company, we're moving into using Python for application development. How can we best manage or reuse packages? Poetry seems nice, but does every package need to be its own project? Well, typically that's what you would do. That's basically you group your packages, or you group your the things that you reuse into packages, and that's how you organize things. Of course, you need to decide, like, does everything need to be a separate project? And that's always, yeah, it's kind of a trade-off of, if you separate out everything, it's going to be a bit more work to manage because you have all of these different packages with different versions. But I mean, the Python package manager can deal with that for you. But maybe there is also some cases where, you know, you don't really need to separate out everything, and it might be more work to split everything into packages than keep everything together. And especially if you're not publishing those packages as open source software, then you know, they don't have to be too focused. They can be specific to your company. So that's another thing to think about. Yeah, so follow up from Nicola, why is it so useful and what can't you do in functional programming that you can in object-oriented programming? So for example, if it's really state focused, let's say you have an example where you have bank accounts, and you have 3 or 4 or 5 different bank accounts, and each bank account has a balance, and you can perform transactions on a bank account or do a transfer from one bank account to another bank account. Doing that with functions is really cumbersome because then you have to pass the bank accounts around all the time. Whereas if you have classes, well, then you create a class bank account. So you can create multiple instances of that. You can pass them to other objects. So that works better. So because of the type of problem that you're solving, object-oriented programming might sometimes be a better solution. But don't forget that there is also the whole area of inheritance that object-oriented programming adds to the mix, which you don't really have with functions. So there's other things you can do because of inheritance as well. Though you need to be careful because typically the more complex you make the inheritance, the higher the coupling also is in your program. So you have to be careful with that. All right, let's see. Okay, Mohamed asks, can you explain why Perl is considered as a glue language? No, I never used Perl, so I don't have any opinion about that. LazyDev asks, the course is web-oriented, also work in C++, solve problems, and I see that the structure and approach are different. Yeah, so the architecture course is going to focus on web and cloud applications because, well, those are typically, that's really the most common application. So I want to basically solve for that first. And that's also the area that I myself have the most experience with. So that's for me also easier to bring more value, basically. Of course, there are other types of architectures that you can think about that are not particularly web-based. I'm not sure how much I can do within the course to include those things, though I think certain aspects will definitely be useful. But the main target is going to be web-based, cloud-based applications. Let's see. Ruffle asks, hey Arjan, I've been QE, automation, Python, Selenium API test. Overall got understanding of software for 1 year. Have done a few BE projects on the side. What's your opinion on how hard would be to switch to backend engineer role and how important are design principles? Yeah, so I'd say backend engineer is typically will be easier to do than front-end engineer because that's like a completely different game. I think if you are already working on automation for a year and you have good understanding of software, then the main thing you need to do is probably get better at some of the more back-end focused things like how to talk to a database, how to set up security, authentication, those kind of things, of course, play a role in back-end development. And another area is if you're also interested in that, more the DevOps side of things, like how is that actually hosted in the cloud? Is it something that's scalable? What kind of architecture are you following? Is it just an API that you're developing, or is it more of, let's say, a queue system, or is it an event handling system? Depending on what you're building, the architecture is going to be different, and your needs are also going to be different. Let's see. Matthew, my team writes a lot of scheduled scripts for data integration management. Do you think it's better to contain all code in a single script or break the process out into multiple files? So also here, I think writing huge scripts means that it's going to be really hard to find the code that you're looking for. And it's also going to be really hard to reuse parts of that code. Well, you can reuse it within the script because everything is in a single script. But if you ever want to split things up a bit more, or you want to, move some code over to a completely different service where you don't have access to that script, then you need to create a copy. And at that point, it becomes really important to split things up more. So you can split things up per, let's say, per task. So you have probably certain data integration tasks or data management tasks that each need a separate sort of functionality. And you can also break things up more into the conceptual things. So probably most of your tasks are going to need some sort of import mechanism that's the same for all the scripts, or a processing mechanism that's the same. And those you can put into a separate package. and then they're also going to be easier to test. Konstantin, what can you recommend to implement functionality with time licenses for some web application which is used by a customer in their infrastructure? So do you mean, I'm just trying to understand your question, when you say time licenses, do you mean subscription-based systems? Is that what you mean? If that's what you would like to have, then I think the most important thing is to look at payment services that often already have everything related to subscriptions. So Stripe, for example, you can have a subscription system that customer enters their credit card information in Stripe, and then they are charged automatically every month. And the typical model you have for that is that you're going to have plans and possibly different tiers within those plans, and then you have like an upgrade or a downgrade structure that modifies basically the amount that you're charging the customer per month or per year, and then you can give a discount. Gaurav, how to deal with convolutional neural net for image processing? Many times it's stuck with the convolutional layer. To be honest, I'm not an AI expert, so I haven't really worked with neural networks all that much, so I can't really answer that question. Hossam, love your content. Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate that. Savan asks, hi Arne, I want to build a new project which involves AI machine learning models along with some libraries with Python bindings. Would you please shed some light on how to structure such a product? It's a very generic question. I think that's kind of hard to answer because the structure depends very much on the type of product that you use. It also depends on, are you going to host those AI machine learning models yourself, or are you using a third-party API that you're integrating with? If that's the case, then of course the whole AI machine learning part is going to be way simpler because you don't have to write any specific software for that. You just have to make sure you can send API requests. But overall, the structure of your product is really going to rely on the type of product it is. Awesome. I have a question in the sense that when to decide it's time for optimization. Do you do that early on or when the project begins to really struggle? So optimization is really only important once you're completely clear that what you're doing makes sense and is stable. And what I've noticed in the past is that optimization early on in any software development project is only going to slow things down, weirdly enough, because if you think that you're optimizing code, and by doing that optimization, you're probably structuring things less optimally for change. It means that when you change the code, it's actually going to be more complicated to do that because it's not optimized for change. And that means that you're going to, as a result of doing that optimization early on, you're going to have to take design decisions that are less optimal, and then things start to be really convoluted. So I'd say that optimization in terms of performance optimization, don't focus on that too much, because especially in the beginning, your code is going to change so often, so much that it's just going to be a waste of your time. And also, if you really want to do optimization, it means you need to spend serious time also understanding what actually contributes to the performance problems, what are the bottlenecks. And sometimes those are not the things you think that are the bottleneck. So it's also going to take time, and you need to pick the right moment in order to do those things. And sometimes it really doesn't matter that something is optimal. I mean, if you're really talking about a highly intensive computation task, well, yes, then, and the user is waiting for that to complete, then it makes sense to optimize that. But if somebody clicks a button and the UI responds 1 millisecond later, that doesn't really matter all that much. So depends on what you need and what fits best with the type of project that you're building. Okay, let's see. Azure recently was working with Docker and Poetry. Things poetry.log helps in caching downloads, so I don't include it in Docker ignore and Git ignore, but is the good practice to commit poetry.log. So I think the idea of the poetry.log file is that you actually don't commit that. I think poetry documentation actually says that somewhere explicitly. I don't have it here in front of me. But of course it helps in caching downloads, but really once you have done that once on your local machine, then the cache is there, so you don't really have to worry about that anymore. So I wouldn't commit it to a Git repository or something like that, because then also every time you do commit, there's going to be changes in the log file, and that's just really annoying. Member question mark says, have you had formal mentorship in your career? How did it help you grow in your career? Yeah, so I definitely got mentorship many times, actually. Not formally, not in the sense that I looked online to find a mentor and then paid somebody to mentor me or something. But I've always found people that work with me on projects. And for example, the companies that I started in the past years, I did that with an ex-colleague of mine from the university who had like a ton of development experience and a ton of experience setting up companies. So in that sense, that was sort of a mentor relationship. But I try to find, let's say, win-win situations where I'm doing something with somebody, and then also there's some mentoring involved because we learn from each other, and I think that works best. Let's see. Edan asks, is there anything you recommend considering either than these 5 methods when planning the architecture? Solid, dry, KISS, Yagni, and TDD. Yeah, so solid we have don't repeat yourself, keep it stupid simple, simple stupid. Now I never know, you ain't gonna need it, and test-driven development. So I'd say that these mostly cover it, except that solid is very much an object-oriented way of thinking about design principles. And I think that's why it doesn't always typically apply to code, especially code in Python. So I typically tend to think more about, instead of solid, I tend to think more about cohesion, which is more about, does your code do one thing? It's kind of similar to the single responsibility principle, but to me it feels more like something that applies to, can also apply to functions, for example. So cohesion. And the second thing is coupling. And coupling means we want to write our code in such a way that we're independent from other systems as possible. And of course, there's always going to be some coupling, because without coupling, code can't run. But you can think about where those touch points are. And secondly, you can use abstraction, things like abstract base classes, protocols, even type annotations, type aliases can be used to introduce some abstraction between the different areas of your code. So those things, plus keeping things simple and not over-engineering things, if you do those 3 things, you're already really far ahead. Arpan, hey Arjan, I'm a seasoned C# developer and recently started working on developing my first Python package. Does Python have a dependency injection container? Any recommendation? I don't think it has this built in, but there are libraries that can actually do this for you. Though, to be honest, I never really found a need for this. I mean, dependency injection itself is mainly we provide something to a function or a method. I have never really found the need to use a separate package for that to structure that more. I know maybe you have an example of where a dependency injection container approach could be useful. Post it in the comments, let me know, but I'd be curious to hear about that. But I never really use that quite a lot. Muhammad, how to refactor legacy code. There is a code file in the project I'm currently working on, which was written way back. No one knows how it works. Any tips on where to start? You don't happen to work at booking.com, do you? I think I saw a talk about almost 10 years ago already. No, not 10 years, 5 years maybe. From the then CTO of booking.com, and they told me they had one script that was responsible for room assignments and checking room availability, and basically nobody knew how it worked, so everybody was too afraid to modify anything in that file, so they didn't really touch it for years, and it was still working. So that's like a really scary thing. So how do you refactor that? Well, probably you won't be able to use any of the legacy code because it's going to be so different than the style that you're working on now. So how do you start? I think you should analyze it from the outside. So you have that piece of legacy code that you're using in various ways in your application. So can you identify, let's say, the minimal thing that you can do and that you can kind of take out of that legacy code and replace it by your own application? Like, what's the smallest thing you can do? And that's where you should start. And then you can go on like, okay, what's the next smallest thing that I can do? And I can replace what the legacy code does with my own code. And before you do that, well, of course, you also have to modify your own code in order to work with the new approach. So what you could do is initially use a design pattern like adapter, for example, so that you can, or strategies so you can switch out the old system with the new system without having to change the new system and breaking everything at the same time. So you first write the adapter so that you know, okay, this is how I'm going to do it in my new approach. And then it still works. And then you replace it by your own implementation. And then you write tests so that you make sure that everything still works as it's supposed to. And then step by step, you can start replacing things. Let's see. Artu, hello from Germany. Hi, welcome here. Savan asks, I think, yeah, this one already asked, sorry. Gustavo, what do you think would be a good approach for a system to structure that will handle integration between several other systems? It's one system that will sync data with several ERPs. I have to think about that a bit. While I do that, I'm going to sip some water. So if it's a system that's between or that integrates several other systems, I think you need to think about whether that's going to happen on the communication level. So are you kind of sitting in between there and these systems are there and they send requests to you? You translate that request somehow and then send it along to the other system? Or is it more that you're handling integration on a data level? So each system produces data of some sort and you need to transform the data into another format so that another system is using that. And I think depending on what you need, whether it's real-time interaction or whether it's more, let's say, more conversion types of tasks, you can set up the systems differently. It's kind of hard for me to give very specific advice because, yeah, it's a bit generic. I'm not really sure. It depends very much on what the needs are going to be. Code Badger, general question. Can you make more complex desktop-like programs with Python? What are the potential limitations with Python versus another language for larger, more complex programs? Well, you can definitely do that. There's plenty of frameworks that allow you to build like pretty complicated things, to be honest. I do think you're going to run into some limitations, especially because Python is not really built for these large-scale GUIs. You would typically do that more in either an operating system specific language. So, I don't know, something like C# for Windows applications, or Swift for Mac applications. Or you would use something else like Electron, and then you use HTML, React, and the whole JavaScript, TypeScript ecosystem to build applications. But you also see there that if you're not building native applications, you're also quickly running into performance problems. You're running into problems where you can't connect natively with the different things that each operating system offers. So Python wouldn't be my first choice to build like really complex desktop applications. I don't think it's really made for that. Adrian asks, hey Arjan, found you a few weeks ago. Yeah, I have been found. Yes, love your content. Keep it going. I will definitely do that. What would you say about event-driven, domain-driven, or merely standalone microservices? So if I build, let's say, a backend architecture and we have different services in the backend, I typically want to make sure that communication between these services is really limited, because otherwise I generally prefer a monolith application, because I think it's just easier to manage than all these different microservices. I had some pretty bad experience where we were experimenting with microservices, and we had one to handle payments, and we had one for authentication, and we had another microservice for database interaction, and then we had to do like a bunch of communication between all of these services, which really slowed things down. So eventually we moved back to a simpler monolith system, and for us that worked actually much better. Yeah, I'd say if you use microservices, be really careful with the communication and make sure that they're actually really independent systems that minimally communicate to keep things manageable for yourself. Alex, thanks for your shared work. You're most welcome. Always interesting. You share real energy. Yes, I have the Dutch energy. We're very energetic people. Konstantin, when is it suitable to use only UVcorn web server in production and do not use ngIns before UVcorn? So I've mainly used these kind of systems in combination with cloud architecture, so things like Kubernetes and or even just cloud functions or Lambda functions in Amazon, AWS. So I haven't used Nginx myself, but I think the main thing that it does is basically ingress and routing, and I'm not sure UVcorn actually does that. I think it just listens to port and that's it. So if you need routing, then you're going to need something like an Nginx server or ingress server in Kubernetes or things like that. Analista Holistico. Hi Arjan, what data structure should a data engineer learn? I use Python and SQL. Any advice to improve my code skills? Yeah, so specifically in Python, you need to know about the basic structures that are there. So what's the difference between tuples, lists, dictionaries, sets? Because each has their pros and cons. So I would definitely start there. As data engineer, I wouldn't learn like really complex structures, like, well, they're not that complex, but like binary trees or things like that. I don't think you really need that unless there is like a very specific use case for you. So I would start with those basics. and really think about, okay, when do we use these different types? For example, tuples are really good for containing things that have different types. So you can have a tuple that has an int, a float, and a string, for example, and those things are immutable. So that's a useful property to know about tuples. Whereas with dictionaries, it's different. You have really a map. So you go from a key to a value, and in a dictionary, the values typically have the same types. And a dictionary has some useful features, such as being able to search in order, log, and time, due to the structure of the hash map that's behind it. A list, on the other hand, is really good for, let's say, sorted information. So if you know already these kind of basic things, it's going to be really helpful. And you have second question. I'm developing a data product to help clinicians in intensive care units using ETL and statistical modeling to predict sepsis. Do you know about software as a service intranet concept? I'm afraid I don't really understand the question. Sorry. So maybe you can clarify. Arthur, is the limited lambda syntax of Python a design flaw or actually an advantage? I wouldn't call it either, actually. I mean, I think it is limited. It definitely can't do as much. I think what you're running into with the lambda syntax of Python is that Python doesn't have a way to group statements. I mean, everything is indented by using tabs, and that's how the interpreter knows, okay, this is part of, let's say, the body of an if statement. But you can't, like with JavaScript or many other languages, use accolades or things like that to get groups of code. And that means that lambda function is always going to be a single line, otherwise it doesn't work. And so I think that's just it. You could call it the design flaw of Python because that's how Python is set up, but it's a trade-off because if you don't need these delimiters, it means your code can actually be shorter. So we have a trade-off of, okay, we have the shorter code, but that means if we have lambda functions, it's also only going to be a single line. And the second, what is maybe a design flaw is the way that you can't really use type hints, type annotations in lambda functions. So, and that's of course because of the colon, which is also used for type annotations and for lambda functions. So I would more call that a design flaw, and I hope they're going to think of a way to still use these type of annotations in lambda functions. I comment, why don't you use your knowledge and become a startup founder and make something extreme? Now I'm curious to find out what sort of extreme thing you want me to build. Actually, I did use my knowledge and I founded like 3 startups. And I realized that, well, a big part of startup success is not so much being a good developer, but is actually on the markets that you're trying to address. So most of the things I did actually failed. I learned a lot because of that, which is nice, but I did try that several times. I actually have another company still that produces a product that's being used. So that's actually, I don't consider that a failure. And we're actually going to release that as fully open source software in the summer. So I want to change a bit the way that we organize that. And the main reason I'm doing that is because I want to fully focus on ArjanCodes YouTube channel and everything surrounding that. So I want to simplify that other company, and we're going to do that by releasing it as open source software so people can use it for free. But, you know, once, I don't know, ArjanCodes becomes, I don't know, boring. I don't know if that ever is going to happen because it's really exciting. But if that ever happens, I might start another company and try something new. Robert, did you ever do research in computer science? If so, what was it about? Yeah, so the main research I did is in computer graphics. So when I was studying, I was really interested in graphics. I thought it was really cool to work on graphic systems. So I remember I did my internship, was a 3-month internship in Caen, France, Normandy, northern part of France. And we built a system that was able to detect or that took small text describing a car accident, like I was driving on the road and there was somebody that was overtaking me, but then there was a tree and we all crashed into the tree, and take a text like that and then visualize it in 3D. And so I built a system for that, which was really fun, by the way. So we used, of course, the deux chevaux car, you know, because that's like the typical French car, and I had these cars crashing into each other, and that was really fun. I did after that mainly research into computer animation, so I was very interested in motion capture, and oh, I see that my course plug is still here. Just remove that, it's a bit overbearing maybe. But so I was really interested in motion capture systems and thinking of ways to reuse motion capture animation, stitch animation into new animations, things like that. So I worked on that for quite a few years until I was kind of tired of doing that and I wanted to do something else. So that's why I also switched to launching a company. All right, let's see. V-Man asks, can you help me understand covariant and contravariant types? I use Python. To be honest, that's the first time I heard those words. What do you mean exactly? Shrey asks, I'm a full-on Python developer, but I'm struggling to make a stable career in development, and I figure out that most of the serious enterprise applications actually use Spring Boot. Yeah, I haven't used that myself, Spring Boot. Often, if that, you will see that the larger enterprises actually use pretty old stuff. Yeah, you can actually see it in Microsoft as well. If you have the newer apps like the Microsoft Teams app, well, under the hood, that actually uses a very old system called SharePoint, which is very powerful, but also really hard to use. So it's often built on large legacy systems, and there is a typical way of doing things that's in large companies very different from the smaller startups. So, and that's why they use these tools. It's not because the tools are typically better. It's just that, well, that's how they do it. And they have hired people for a long time that know how to use these tools, and they don't want to learn new things. So they just use that because, well, it works and they have a lot of money. Ashish, how would you split a complex multi-step data science workflow? Would you have data ingestion, database connection, data transformation, model class, and inference classes, each with custom methods? Yeah, so I haven't done myself really complex data science applications, but I have worked with several companies that are doing data analysis and looking at their code and seeing how they set up things. And what often helps is to think about your workflow in not just in the steps of reading the data, transforming the data, and exporting the data again, but also think about, okay, maybe we can design like intermediate structures that we can use to split up things more. So instead of going through a whole complex process with lots and lots of different files and classes and scripts and whatnot, maybe you can split things up so that you do things in steps. So for example, as a first step, you could load a data set from a CSV file and then transform it into a format that's easier to process for you. Like maybe that's a JSON file, or maybe that's stored in a database so you can query it. And then maybe in the next steps, when you need to do more processing, you can introduce more intermediate formats that make the processing really simple. And the way that I've typically think about it is that basically every step in your pipeline, and that's not just for data processing, but actually in many cases this makes things a lot simpler, is really be strict about the kind of data that you accept. So instead of having your code accept all sorts of different data, it's something can be a string or an integer or whatever, or it can be a list of things. No, just be very strict and just allow for one thing. And then as a pre-processing step, you make sure that the data is completely clean, that it adheres exactly to what you expect. And that way, your in-between steps, your in-between processing steps are also very strict and very specific, which makes them much easier to test. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about it. Broken Sith. Hey Arjan, do you know any good tutorials for creating packages and saving them to a private PyPy index? So I did a video actually about creating packages and publishing them on PyPy. So you can take a look at that. I think I published that a few weeks ago. And whether you're doing that on PyPy or some other repository, that's actually just switching out a URL mostly. ArjanLive, how many courses do you have? Currently, well, one sort of, which is the software design course. So I'm working on a software architecture course, which focuses more on systems versus design. I do have a Skillshare course, which is more about Python. But I might also actually host that on my own website, because I noticed some people really don't like Skillshare all that much. So I want to make sure that there's also a way to do the course without having to sign into Skillshare. And I'm going to release something else in, well, about 1 to 2 months. It's a nice little course that you might like very much. Akshat, virtual environment with poetry video was amazing. Thank you. Are you planning to make a similar video with using Hatch? Not planning, but thanks for the suggestion. I will definitely take a look and see if that's interesting to cover on the channel. Patrick, what's the best way to learn data structures and algorithms? Oh, wait a minute. So the best way to learn about data structures and algorithms is, in my opinion, getting practice with it and seeing how they work. And maybe as you could do a sort of little exercise and take, let's say, a few example small projects where you need to do something with data, and then experiment with the different data structures and see how it works. So, for example, take a random data set, CSV file, JSON file, whatever, and load that data into your Python script, and then do some processing, and then see what happens if you use different data structures, and see what happens in terms of performance, in terms of capabilities, what things are easy to do, what things are harder to do. I think that's going to help you learn a lot about how they work. And Python has, like most of the core data structures that you're going to need, is all built in. So doing that in Python is really a great way to learn about that. And then, of course, if you want to go deeper and you would like to have more of the, let's say, theoretical background, there are certainly books and courses you can read about that. I think there's a couple of these data structure Bibles from computer science that are independent of the programming language that really teach you everything that you need to know. E-double, creating a Django project with celery tasks. I have to get all the records from one model. Problem is that it has 300,000 records and it's slow and consumes a lot of memory with ORM. Is raw SQL better? So I think the issue to me sounds more like, I mean, ORM does add, let's say, uses more memory than using raw SQL queries because you have to create objects. but it looks to me that the problem is maybe that you're trying to do it with 300,000 records at once. So can you think of a way to do this in steps, like with pagination, and make it a bit more easier to manage? That way it's also better that if, for example, something breaks in the first 30,000 records, or let's say after you've processed 150,000 record 150,001 actually has a problem, and then you have to start all over again. Can you think of a way of doing it in batches? Or can you think of a way of doing things more in steps and not having to get all the data all at once? That's, I think, going to really simplify. If you can figure out a way to do that, and then it doesn't matter all that much anymore whether you're using an ORM or SQL queries, because you've solved the memory problem differently. Christos, hey, I'm following your Dash tutorial to build some stuff at work. Could you elaborate a bit on why you structure your project like you did in the video with the source folder? You find it a bit cumbersome working like that, but probably you can see the benefit SN2 beginner. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, you know, the structure that I follow is not like this is the structure that you're supposed to follow. It depends also very much on your application and what your application is supposed to be doing, and the structure should follow that and make the most sense in that context. So especially if, let's say, I'm doing tutorials, I typically try to think of a structure that makes sense for that tutorial, but it might not always be the right structure. So I wouldn't get too hung up on that you're supposed to use that structure. Try to find something that works for you, and don't listen too much to me. Okay. Andre, how do you split your time between producing code and refactoring? If you mean by producing code really writing new lines of code, I'm doing that less and less, actually. I mean, especially once you have an application and you are tweaking things, you are improving things, then you're actually spending most of your time reading the code and refactoring the code, and not so much writing new lines. And of course, refactoring code also means you're writing new lines of code, but you're not starting with empty files and then filling in everything. You're really more refactoring and changing and updating things. I find a lot of time goes into, especially because I work a lot in the TypeScript domain as well, is that a lot of time goes into switching frameworks and updating node modules, and then fixing the code so that things are not broken anymore. It's getting a bit out of hand, to be honest. But definitely way more refactoring than actually writing completely new pieces of code. And the interesting thing is that with tools like GitHub Copilot, this really saves me a lot of time, and Copilot also specifically writes a lot of the new code for me. So I'm not writing that many lines of code myself anymore, completely from scratch. I use tools to help me. Konstantin, do you know workable ways to protect Python code, API server in production, from reading and modification, or at least make it harder? Assume someone has an HDD from our physical server or SSH access. So I'm not sure you can actually do that in Python. I don't think it has, I mean, I'm not sure if that's possible, but I mean, Python does create like the interpreted bytecode file. So I'm not sure if you still need the original Python files in order to run those, because then you can just use the bytecode, but I never actually tested that out. Another way to do it is to move some of your code to C++ and then call the C++ code from Python, and then at least that part is compiled into a DLL or a library, and then at least that part is protected. But doing this with Python specifically, if somebody has access to your hard drive, yeah, I don't think it's that easy. The other question you should ask is whether it really is that helpful to protect your code. What I most often noticed is that I was worried about that in the beginning a lot, like, oh my God, what if somebody uses my code or something? But nowadays, yeah, there's not really that much that's secret anymore. I mean, there's lots of open source projects. Of course, you need to protect your API keys and things like that, but those shouldn't be in code anyway. They should be set as environment variables. And if you have a SSH into your actual running server, then it's really hard to to guard access to those things. All right, Hector, Arjan, I would like to know how to vectorize long lists of data classes to speed up summary calculations. It's a very specific question. I haven't really built anything like that, so I don't have any specific advice for that. I think the main thing with data classes and objects in Python in general is that you need to make sure that your instance variable access is fast. And the way you do that with classes and with data classes by using slots versus the standard dictionary. So if you just create a class in Python, by default it's the data is stored in a dictionary. So that's where all the instance variables are. And that's nice because it's very dynamic. You can dynamically add instance variables like what we're doing with Python, but it also means that accessing those things is going to be a bit slower. And if you use slots, then you avoid that problem, but your number of instance variables, part of an object, is also fixed. But if you know what your data, how your data is structured, you know what that looks like, then slots is going to give you about 20% performance improvement. Engineering. How would you structure for test-driven development an API that requires a connection to a database, an MQTT broker, possibly to another third-party API? Do you inject all three or more as dependencies? Yeah, so if you're building an API, so you should typically, in any case, split up the part that does the routing from the part that does the operations, because then you can test them separately as well. And that's, if you are using test-driven development, then that's a good way to start, because then you can, for example, start by writing the test for the routes, and then you build the routes, and then you write the test for the operations, and then you can build the operations, or the other way around, because they're then sort of independent, so that doesn't really matter. So typically databases, or a database is then something that you would inject into your operations, because then you could replace that database by a mock database or a mock service that allows you to test your operation. If you communicate with third-party APIs, then you need to wrap those calls in, let's say, a wrapper class that does that communication for you, and then you can inject that as an object into your operation, and then again you can mock that in your test. All right. Then we have Matteo. What would be easiest front-end framework to pick up for a person with no experience in front-end? Yeah, so front-end is really like a whole different ballgame. I said it before. And it is actually getting pretty complicated, especially if you start building like React apps and combining tons of libraries. I mean, it's not that hard to use. There's quite a bit of boilerplate code that's is often generated for you already, so you don't have to worry about that. But especially if you're in, let's say, the TypeScript ecosystem, that's like a huge rabbit hole. You have Next.js and the whole ecosystem with node modules and different frameworks, so that makes it really hard, especially if you have no experience. There are some alternatives that are actually way simpler. Think about tools like Svelte, for example, which is relatively new. It's already also a couple of years old, but it operates on in a much simpler way. And if you want to build, there's also Tailwind, which is a really easy way to style your pages. So I'd say get started with those types of tools and don't dive into React immediately. I do highly recommend using TypeScript instead of JavaScript, because the type annotations, we all know I love type annotations, right? But TypeScript also really helps in avoiding errors that then are hard to detect in JavaScript. Casper, how to do logging so that half of the code wouldn't be for logging. For example, trace level log should be really specific, which makes other code harder to read. Yeah, so you want to avoid that your code is riddled with logs, so you can't really see what your code is actually doing. One way to do it is that you use a decorator-like mechanism. So I did a video about logging a while ago where I think I showed how that works. But the way that you would do that is that you would create a logging decorator that would, for example, log the result of each function call, and then you simply write that on top of above your function, and then you don't have to add logs to your code. So that's one way to do it. There might, I'm not sure. Yeah, you could maybe do that. Like VS Code has also a way to define regions in your code, so you can basically open and close different segments of your code. So you could put all your logs in a region in VS Code, and then it can open and close, so at least you don't see it all the time, but that's maybe not ideal. BlackRock token of appreciation. Oh, thank you so much, man. That's really kind. Thank you for your support. Sergey. Hey Arjan, how to keep all those solid drive 12 factor app kits, etc. design principles in mind when developing? What do you think about the approach? Make it work right, make it work fast. Yeah, so that's in principle what you're doing with the principles is to make it work right. So but what I don't really agree with is the difference between make it work and make it work right. I think make it work fast, that's more the optimization part. So that's definitely something that you should save until the end. Because before that, it's only going to confuse things. But the difference between make it work and make it work right, I don't really see it as a sequence in that sense. So when I write code, I do spend time already in the beginning thinking about, okay, how can I set this up properly so that it's easy for me to change, because you are always going to have to change it. And that's for a big part to make it work right. That's by using all of these different principles. And it's often not so much a question of spending more time in the beginning. I don't really feel it works that way for me. It's really more about taking a different decision in the beginning and doing it one way, which is, let's say, more aligned with those design principles, versus doing it another way, which doesn't necessarily take less time, but is just a different way of doing it. For example, nowadays I really focus on, or let's say nowadays I really tend to use functions more than classes. But writing one or the other is not really harder, right? It's just a choice in the beginning. I just find that if I write functions, it's typically easier for me to organize and change things later on. Because, well, a lot of the things I do with functions are, let's say, action focused, or focused on the flow of data, and not so much state focused anymore. And that also makes it easier to test. So I'd say make it work right, and then make it work fast. Most unicorn, I don't understand the one function should do only one thing rule. The way I see it, it's impossible because there will eventually be some parent function that starts many other functions. Yeah, so it's all about context in the end. So what is the one thing? So the definition of that one thing, I mean, that also makes it unclear, right? That also makes it a hard principle to apply to your code, because what do we consider to be one thing? It's often in the eye of the beholder. So if, let's say, the parent function, let's say often in a Python script, you have a bunch of functions, then you have a main function that actually calls those functions. Well, then you could argue that the one thing that the main function is responsible for is the orchestration. And I think my camera just switched off. Oh, so now we're completely in the dark. Let me just switch to my webcam for a bit. So there we go. That looks a bit better. Actually, it doesn't look better, but at least I'm visible. So, so doing the one thing doesn't drill down completely to everything, basically, and it's really about the context. So the main function could be more responsible for the orchestration, but that doesn't mean that it does everything that it basically does. Let's see. Marcel, do you think Django is still a good choice for 2023, 2024? I think it's a totally fine platform. Lots of people are using it, so why not? Especially if you have experience with it. It's pretty easy to get set up with Django, and depending on what you need, it's a good fit. I haven't used it myself that much, also because if I build, let's say, really more web services, I tend to use TypeScript more for that, but Django works totally fine. All right, let's see. Carlos, what's the best way to do integration tests of database systems? So typically, if you work with a database system, you will have and you use dependency injection. So you provide access to the database via an object that you provide to your operations. Then you can do a mock of that object when you write your test. So for example, let's say your operation needs to update a table in the SQL database, or in the database, and for example needs to update customer information or something. So then you could provide an object that's the database access that allows you to do that particular low-level operation, and then you can write test for the higher level part that uses that object by replacing the database with a mock. Adriana, what are your favorite machine learning libraries? I've been playing around with OpenAI's API for the time being. So it's not really a machine learning library. It's more like an API access. I haven't done that much myself with machine learning, although I did play around a bit with TensorFlow for a while, but that was already a while ago. Let's see. Hi Arjan, Darius. Do you have some tips on developing a hosted application that's a simplified BI tool, has auth built in, allows for tables and charts and PDF reports? Could you do a video on it? Yeah, so the thing that comes most to mind is either Streamlit or Dash. I mean, those have a lot of capabilities for charts and things like that. Especially Dash, I worked a bit with tools from Plotly, and that works quite well. Streamlit I have used a bit, but haven't really dive into yet. Let me just try to switch on my camera again. I think it's having some overheating problems. So okay, I'm not sure, it doesn't want to show, so we're just going to keep it with the webcam for the time being. So let's see, where was I? Let's see. Arjan, which architecture do you prefer with Django REST framework? Yeah, so if you're using a platform like Django, then you're typically already kind of tied to the way that you do things in Django. And that's often the thing with those frameworks. So you don't really have to think about architecture anymore, actually, if you do that. I haven't used the Django REST framework specifically myself, so I don't have any architectural tips specifically to that. Ben, are you going to attend PyCon in the US or the EuroPython conference? Not this year, maybe next year. I might do one or two other conferences, but I'm not really sure yet for this year. I still had quite a busy schedule myself due to things happening around my current company where I want to streamline things, so that's taking me a lot of time. Also with ArjanCodes, we're now building out a slightly larger team, so that is also coming with its own challenges, I must say. We're really in a phase where we're trying to scale things up a bit, structure things a bit, and that means I have to spend a lot of time, you know, thinking a bit more strategically about how we're doing things to make sure that we're still producing valuable content on YouTube and that we're able to manage everything that we're doing. The Manoman can. Hey man, do you think solving, say, 150 lead code problems is a good idea? In the area of sophisticated search in ChatGPT, are these basics still relevant for self-taught programmers? Cheers from Ankara. So I think the way you need to think about solving these programming problems is not so much about those specific problems, but it's really about growing an analytical mindset. And I think that's where these problems typically help. And it's also the reason why some level of computer science education is still valuable, even though if you're going to work as a software engineer later on in a company, you will probably learn way more things when you're working versus when you're still studying at school or university. But having that basic knowledge really helps you train your analytical mindset, and that's incredibly important if later on you want to tackle larger projects, you want to really be able to solve larger problems. You need to have that problem-solving mindset, and these type of coding problems, even though they're quite basic, they can definitely help you train those skills. Vedant asks, would you explain a bit about serverless architecture and also where it makes sense to use it? Or what will be, or what will be the application? Yeah, so serverless architecture, so there's, let's say, different varieties of that. If you look at Google Cloud, for example, I've been using that quite a bit, is that on, let's say, the most serverless end of things, you have Cloud Functions, which is really like telling Google, hey, here I have some code. If you just host that somewhere, I don't really care. And then if I go to that URL, then I want you to run that code, and that's it, basically. And then if it runs often, lots of times, then Google is going to scale things up for you automatically, and you basically pay per time that your code is run. Then you have something that's more, is still serverless, but is like a virtual service that's running somewhere. So in that case, you don't give Google a piece of code, but you give it a Docker image, which contains whatever you want. That can be an API service. It can be something else. it doesn't really matter, but that's like you have way more control over the environment that way, because with the let's say completely serverless function, you can indicate a couple of basic things like what version of Python do you want to use and what packages are going to be installed. But you have very little control over the type of machine in terms of CPU, memory, etc. So if you need more control over that and you want to have some influence on, I mean, for example, let's say you're writing a Python backend that also needs to store files locally from time to time, or do other things that require you to interact with the file system. Then it's probably going to be helpful to do that in a Docker container environment. I mean, Google, if you use Cloud Functions or Lambda functions in AWS, that's probably also going to run in a Docker container, except you don't have control over what kind of container that is, or very limited. So that's, at Google, that's called Cloud Run, that middle version of where you just give it a container and say, hey, host this for me somewhere. Then the next step in serverless is Kubernetes, where you have more full control over a whole architecture of different kinds of services that are run and that are being made accessible via an ingress service. That's also all part of Kubernetes. And then you have more control over, because if that middle version, the Docker container, that's just hosted somewhere, you have some control over what you can do within the container. You will have, in some cases, some control over what kind of machine that is running on, but I think even Cloud Run at Google, you have very limited control over that. Actually, you can't really say what kind of machine that's supposed to run on. You can change memory. If you use Kubernetes and you have a hosted Kubernetes cluster, then you basically have complete control over all of those aspects. So you can create a node pool with specific machines that are going to serve exactly what you need to do. And for my company, where we were building a tool for educational institutes, this is actually what we had to do, because we had one part of our platform that was responsible for dealing with database interaction, for serving the front end, so those could be relatively lightweight. But we had another part of our application that was capable of running code in the cloud. And then, of course, if you need to do that, well, then you need a faster machine. So we needed separate setups in terms of CPU, memory for the different services that we had in our whole platform. So that's where something like Kubernetes really helps. However, if at all possible, try to avoid using Kubernetes if you don't have to, because doing things with cloud functions, simple things, is actually way easier to set up, and you can always move to a more complicated setup later. Adriana, will you ever do a Udemy course? Yeah, I've been thinking about that, but it's also going to like create a bit of confusion in all of the different platforms that I'm active on. I mean, we have currently my current course is hosted on basically a self-hosted system. Then I have Skillshare courses. If I add Udemy to the mix, it's going to be like way too much. So I think I mean I can't say it for sure now, but I don't think I will do a Udemy course soon. I might do let's say a cheaper self-hosted course though, to kind of give a bit more balanced offering, because well, my current course is not the cheapest, so it's not affordable to everyone. Alexander, welcome to ArjanCoder. You're a member. Congratulations. Thank you for your support. Robert Ducky, if you had to do a PhD again, which topic would you choose? Any topic that interests you in distributed system? Oh, so you're already pushing me into a certain direction. So if I would do a PhD again, which topic would I choose? I'm not sure I would actually even choose a computer science topic, to be honest. I might do something that's more related to psychology or something weird like that. Actually, I really don't want to do a PhD anymore. It was like 4 years of really hard work, and so I don't want to do a PhD anymore. So let's keep it at that. I think a lot of the things that I really dislike about doing a PhD is that it's so focused on the ego, you know, focused on you. Everything is about personal growth, getting that title, and then in the whole academic world, it kind of continues like that. So you start with doing your master, which gets you the diploma. Then you go for your PhD, which gets you another diploma. And then you want to become a professor, which gives you more titles and more credibility. And it becomes like a whole ego-serving thing that's, to be honest, I think is quite poisonous. It's one of the reasons I left the university, actually. I find working at a company is way simpler because you have no choice but to focus on delivering something that actually helps people. Because otherwise, people are not going to pay for what you do. So that removes automatically your ego, from almost everything that you do. And to me, that feels much nicer. Let's see. Karen. Hey, I love your videos. Thank you so much. I'd like to know what would be the major changes to make to rise from a senior level developer to a staff level developer. Ooh, a staff level developer. So typically the way, if I interpret this correctly, so I would say staff level to me sounds more like a permanent contract kind of thing. If you look at developer levels, you typically have junior, sometimes media, and then senior. And then as a follow-up to that, you have more a lead developer role. So the main difference between a senior developer and a lead developer is that a lead developer will have more management responsibilities than a senior developer. And you should ask yourself whether that's something that you really want to do, because, well, that's very different from being a senior developer. Senior developer just means you're really good at your job and you're also attacking, let's say, the more complicated problems, which is a lot of fun. Whereas a lead developer, you're probably going to lead more a team of people that are going to solve those problems for you. And you will guide them, you will mentor them, obviously, but it's going to be quite different. Not all companies are that strict about those titles. Sometimes a senior developer also leads a team. Sometimes a lead developer also does still a lot of coding, so that's not as clear-cut. But I think the major difference is between you deciding whether you want to have a more hands-on coding kind of job or whether you would like to have more of a management team lead sort of job. And both have different skills that are needed in order to do them well. Alan, any technical interview tip experience that you can share? I did a video about job interviews, actually specifically for getting a senior developer job. You can look on my YouTube channel. There's the video on there. General tip is to not worry too much about, very specific technical questions like write an algorithm to sort a list or something. I wouldn't worry about that too much. Be yourself in an interview. Be authentic. Prepare, especially learn about the company that you're applying. It's just as important that you are a fit for the company than that the company is a fit for you. That's equally important because you need to be happy at the job that you're applying to. But watch the video. I have a couple of other tips in there as well. Flavio, what can a new programmer do if they have a creativity block for new projects? I've been doing code challenges, but they feel pointless, easy, and I haven't found open source projects on my level. So instead of looking for projects, maybe you could try and launch something yourself. So then it's automatically going to be at your level. I'd say make sure it's something that's that you find interesting and that triggers you and that you think gives you a challenge. And that's easier to do if you start your own project, because then you have way more control over what you're going to do versus just contributing to an open source project. So start something yourself. I mean, there's plenty of things to think about, right? Especially with all the new AI tools that are now out there. There's so much possibilities to integrate AI into all kinds of different areas, different types of applications, and think of new things you can do with the tools that we have now. So I think there's plenty of opportunities. So just start something fun that is related to your hobby, for example, or something else that you find interesting, and build something nice. I'm going to try my other camera one more time and see if that's working. Okay, it's still black. I'm not sure why. Doesn't matter. We just do it like this. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Vedant, do you do any meetups? Not yet, but they had like this crazy idea of maybe doing like a European tour or something at some point. I think that could be cool to like go to different places in Europe and then do like a workshop of the day and just get some people together. If you're interested in that, let me know in the comments, and I'm gonna think about that. Let's see. Robert Ducky, open source is scary. Nah, it's not scary. It's okay. Can you do a video on how to start with the knowledge built on from the course? Yeah, so it could be a good topic actually to talk about how to contribute to open source projects. So thanks for the suggestion. Protic Roy, what about AI replacing our jobs? I don't really believe that's going to happen, at least not anytime soon. I think it's the same is happening that is always happening, basically. I mean, even if you look at ChatGPT right now, which is like everybody's talking about that, right? But actually, like 90% of the people don't even know that it exists. Honestly, if I ask my parents or anybody in my family who's not in computer science and who's not on social media all the time, and I tell them about ChatGPT, they're like, what's that? I don't care. And I think most people are actually like that. So don't forget that we're living in a pretty tiny bubble of, tech people talking about this kind of stuff. And I mean, you even see that there's like several times where this has sort of happened, right? We have the whole internet in the early 2000s. Well, I mean, there are plenty of companies still they don't really care about the internet. You have to call them to, and maybe they use some basic server so that you can actually find them, but they don't have a website. You just give them a call and then, I don't know, somebody to repair the sewer or something. Yeah, they don't really care. Or when phones and social media came, well, there's still plenty of companies that are completely ignoring social media. And I'm not saying that all of those companies are doing well. They're not doing that well. But I mean, it's going to take a long time before these kind of shifts really are going to have a major effect. And the effect that they have is sort of completely unpredictable. I mean, if you think about what ChatGPT can do now, that's nice. It can generate text. It can really do useful things. It can help you clarify your thoughts. So for the time being, it's just a tool that helps you do that, and that's also wrong quite often. And you see that typically happen when the subjects become a bit more complicated. And why does that happen? Because, well, ChatGPT can find a lot of data on the internet about the basic stuff. That's why, let's say on YouTube, there are so many development YouTubers that focus on beginners, because that's like there's so many beginners, but there's less intermediate advanced people. And that means there's less content. That means that ChatGPT can learn less about that content, and then the results are going to be worse. I recorded a video last week about that. I'm going to publish in a few weeks, where I'm going to show you how it actually goes wrong with things like design principles and design patterns. It does actually a pretty bad job at that. If you ask it to explain the bridge design pattern and you dig a bit deeper, you see that the answers sort of seem to make sense, but when you look at it more closely, actually most of it is actually wrong. And that's the problem, because the methodology is that it's generating text based on heuristics and on what it can find in terms of data on the internet. And of course it uses lots and lots and lots of data, but still it's not going to take away the jobs of the experts. I really don't believe that, because the data is not there. And as we become better at what we do, and we learn new things and we introduce new things, the data is still not going to be there, because, well, that's what, experts do. So I don't think it's going to replace all our jobs. It's just going to make our jobs a whole lot easier and help us solve a couple of the more basic things that we now have to spend manual time on. So tools like GitHub Copilot, or tools that help you refactor your code more easily. I think those are going to be really helpful, but you still need a developer to solve the complex cases and make sure that everything is coherent. So I'm not afraid of that. Let's see. So a couple more questions. Hey Sibran, good that you're here. Duke, can you do similar functions to func tools like you did with iter tools? I rarely use func tools and I'm wondering if I'm missing out. I actually did a video about func tools, although that's a while ago, where I mainly focused on partial function application. And that's actually a really nice tool that I use quite a bit. There's a couple of other things in there as well, but I think by far partial function application is one of the most useful things in func tools. So start there, I'd say. Oh, Dale actually literally says what I just said. Okay, func tools partial, yes. Oh, and reduce, yeah, that's also a very useful function actually. Yeah, and LRU cache is nice too, because that allows you to basically cache your computed property value. So that's also really nice. Jim, hi Arjan, I believe you're Dutch. That is absolutely correct. I am 100% Dutch. So you can follow along. I finished an MBO degree, which is in English, I think, vocational education, vocational school in software development. I did quite some web development, but wanted more. I'm now studying bioinformatics, HBO, which is University of Applied Science. It's like data science, but with biology. That would be like a really great tagline, right? If you have your studies, bioinformatics. It's like data science, but with biology. I like that. I'm, however, really bored now because I'm being taught programming all over again. Yes. So what's your question? I'm guessing you want to find out what you should do to not be bored anymore, right? Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the problem of traditional education, that it's like one size fits all, and often they do allow you to skip certain parts if you already learned. I mean, in your case, I don't understand why they are teaching you programming, because that's what you already know from your MBO education. So you might want to talk with your teacher to see if they can let you skip some parts so that you can focus on the more interesting bits. But yeah, alternatively, I mean, that's what you need to do anyway at the end, is to basically take things in your own hands. And especially if you start working after your studies, nobody is going to tell you what you should learn about anymore. Well, maybe your boss or your colleagues up until some level, but you're really in charge in the end of what you learn and the skills that you learn. So don't depend on traditional education to tell you that. Find your own way and find the things that you think are important for you to learn. Focus on that. Iles, can you recommend somebody who creates content on test automation? I don't have a YouTuber in mind in particular. There are a couple of YouTubers that are more, say, systems or focused. I think Dave Farley from Continuous Delivery is really a nice channel that has very good in-depth content. So I highly recommend you follow him. And other than that, I sometimes watch videos of Network Chuck. Also like him quite a bit. But that's not really about test automation. It's just a cool guy to watch. Anyway. Camilla, hey Arjan, I want to write a text-to-process flow diagramming tool using PyDot and Graphviz. What are some good data types for storing the data in Python? So it's a bit hard to say because it depends, I guess, on how you're going to query those data types. I mean, in Python, like the common ones are lists, tuples, dictionaries, and sets. But I'd say if you're really looking at like a flow diagram, that sounds to me more like a graph style data structure. And you might want to look into some libraries that allow you to model graphs and things like that, because doing that with the built-in data structures is maybe a bit cumbersome. So I would look into that. I don't have a specific library I can really recommend. Maybe somebody else has a suggestion. Arthur, what languages do you speak? So I'm guessing you're talking about real human languages. So I speak Dutch, obviously. I speak English, also obviously. I did internship in France, so I also had to learn French because otherwise I couldn't survive, basically. I do know a bit of German because I grew up near the border of Germany, basically in the northern part of the Netherlands. And so I also speak the dialect from the northern part of the Netherlands, although I'm not really practicing that anymore. Let's see. Unsocialized Kitten. What should a developer without commercial experience write in a resume? So I would focus in part on the skills that you learned. You can mention projects, non-commercial projects that you've been part of, hobby projects, maybe some projects from your school. You will certainly have done some project where you worked in a team or worked with maybe a sort of customer as part of your education. I think if you mention those things, that's already a good start. Koya, love from the Philippines. Thank you, man. Love back. Alexander, hi Arjan. I work with Python in enterprise content and we have the feeling that Python is not quite there, where other languages are for that purpose. Java Spring, okay. So what are you planning to use Python for? I think that's a big question to think about. Like most programming languages, like most frameworks, Python has a set of specific use cases that it's really good for. For example, I mean, its main intention is being used as a scripting language. So that means that it's really easy to write small scripts that integrate well, that allow you to write things very quickly, loading some data, doing some processing. It has lots of things built in, so you don't need to install a ton of external dependencies. So for everything where you need something that's set up quickly, you don't want to worry about installing a bunch of extra crap on your system. You just want to write some script and get some work done. Python is really good for that. If you want to use it in a way that Python is not built for, then yes, you're going to run into limitations. So if you want to build, let's say, a really highly performant desktop app with a complicated GUI and lots of different other things, then, well, maybe Python is not the tool to use for that. So if you work with Python at your company, think really carefully about what you're using it for and use it for the parts where it really shines. Elon, hey Arjan, how do you think, what is the difference between a full-time employee and a contract? By contractor, I mean the person working fully remotely from another country like Poland or Ukraine. Yeah, the other country depends, of course, where you live. If you live in Poland, then the other country is not Poland. So the difference, well, if I've worked actually with employees both fully remote and both in the company, locally in the company. I've also worked with people who were employees, really with the contracts and everything, versus people who are freelancers. And there's quite a few differences between them. I found the difference between local versus remote pretty small. So we currently in our company work with a developer who is fully remote. He lives in Turkey, actually. But with the tools we have nowadays, like Teams, it's actually really easy to work together remotely, and we don't really have to... there's not really a big difference between working remotely in that way versus being part of a team locally. Although we still organize meetups, so we do that a couple of times a year so that we still meet in person, because that's also still very nice. Somebody who's an employee versus somebody who's a freelancer contractor has typically a different relationship with your company. So an employee will feel more part of the team, feel more part of the whole, versus a freelancer who will, well, basically they're less tied to your company. You're just hiring them to do some work. So that's also different. So for example, an employee, you're going to, if you lead a company, you're going to give the employee some space to do some personal development, for example, go to a conference. Well, you wouldn't pay a freelancer to go to a conference. You pay the freelancer for the work that they deliver specifically for your company. But the other side of that is that the freelancer is somebody who is going to have a vested interest in making sure that they deliver quality, whereas an employee, if they're, let's say, on a permanent contract and they've been in the company for a long time, they might at some point lose motivation to really deliver high quality. So that's always something you have to make sure that, I noticed with employees, you have to be careful to always offer a challenging environment and make sure that they're a happy member of the team. So that's some extra overhead, but it also gives good results, because that means you have somebody who is really part of what you're working on, part of the team, and is more invested in what you're doing. Victor, if you're employed at the moment, what's your salary? Yeah, so I'm actually unemployed. Well, I'm not really unemployed, but I'm a business owner. So actually what that means for me is that I want to make sure that my business, which is ArjanCodes, actually, that's my main business at the moment. I want to make sure that my business has the highest chance of survival. So I pay myself like the minimum salary possible for a business owner. And there's a number in the Netherlands for that. So that's what I pay myself. So I mean, I don't need that much personally. I don't need to have, I don't travel that much. I don't need an expensive house or something. So I have a family I need to support, and you know, we want to have a nice life, but I'm not paying myself that much actually. Right. Amo, can you cover REST API development using Flask and methodologies to be followed to write production level code? Yeah, so the most important thing there is actually making sure that you're focusing on stability, that you're following test-driven development. So make sure routes are separate from the operations that the API is doing, and use dependency injection to make sure that you can mock things out and that you can write tests for things. So that's the basis. Downless TV, unsure about handling null and empty string values in combination of front-end, back-end. Using Django, also wondering about the allow blank, allow null settings on the model fields. Yeah, so this is really about how strict you are with your data that you're communicating between the front end and the back end. So I typically tend to write applications that are pretty strict. I feel by being strict, by saying, no, if you want to supply this, don't supply none, it should be a string, right? By doing that, you simplify your code because you don't have to take care of that special case. And the problem is that once you start allowing for these special cases, then you're going to be tempted for consistency purposes to do it all over your code. And that means that your code is going to be riddled with if statements, checking that you didn't send the list instead of a string, or that something is none or not. No, just, you know, be strict and allow only a very specific type of thing. And if not, well, sorry, try again. And that way, so you use typically validation frameworks for that, like Pydantic has that, for example, and you can combine that with something like FastAPI, that you validate your requests to make sure that they fit exactly what you can solve, what you can operate on in your API, and that's what you do. And then you're strict and you can keep things simpler. It means it's simpler to test. It means it's simpler to change, simpler to extend, and that's ultimately what's going to make you develop faster by being strict. All right. Nightcoder, would you make a class or use name tuples for having clarity with data you only use in a few places? I find myself using array indices and it's less readable. Yeah, so often, you know, you get like a result from an API call, which is like an object containing a list of things, and then you have to access the element 0 in that list, and then you get like the first element of that again. So of course that's not, it doesn't really help in terms of clarity. I think named tuples, I never use them. I think there are better mechanisms, in particular data classes that are actually, I find, easier on the eyes because you have a nice class definition and it's really simple to see what is going on. So even if you use it only in a few places, it's still helpful to define those things, I find, especially if you later on want to add some validation, then you already have the basis there. So that's really helpful. Downless, is frontend supposed to send null in the field values of the JSON instead of empty strings? Typically, yes. You wouldn't send back empty strings, you would send back a null value. At least that's normally how I see it. Or it's just undefined and it's lacking from the JSON structure if it's null. So it depends a bit on the service that you're using. Let's see. Can you make videos on microservices using frameworks like Flask? Yeah, so I haven't focused that much on the channel on microservices. Though, I mean, it typically falls on the things like hosting things in a Kubernetes cluster and how you split up things into different services. So that's definitely something that I could look into, and that also fits well with my upcoming software architect course. So that's nice. Thanks for the suggestion. Sai says your Python code refactoring looked god level. What books help you get to that level? Actually, if I'm honest, not really books have helped me that much. What really helped me a lot was having to work for 5 years on code that every time we had to switch to I started a company in 2016. We developed a product. It didn't work. We changed things 3 times. It still didn't work. We changed it to yet another audience. So I had to kind of adapt myself to write code that was ridiculously easy to change because we were changing things all the time because we just couldn't get the company to work, basically. So every time that happened, I got, let's say, better at writing the code in such a way that basically I was assuming, while I was writing the code, I was assuming that, okay, you know what, in 6 months, I'm going to have to change this again anyway. So I'm going to set it up in a way so that I can thank myself 6 months later. And of course that happened. So then, that becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But then that sort of helped me really grow personally in the way that I write my code, because I really focus on, okay, in 6 months, is this still easy to read? Can I change this? And I'm not assuming anything at the moment anymore. So that mindset really helped me. Let's see. Sonny, your thoughts on MLOps? Yeah, I haven't really worked on that myself, so no clear thoughts yet, but maybe in the future. Daniel, how to store big payloads in testing, where I have some const and some variables to change. So if you're assuming to, or if you're referring to test data sets, you actually don't have to store that test data in your Python scripts themselves. So you can store that in like separate CSV files, or even make a test local SQLite database that contains test data and use that on the fly. So that's typically how I do that if I have a bigger data set. Hi, I'm one of your viewers in Taiwan. Now in Taiwan it's 3 a.m. Oh, I hope you don't have to wake up early tomorrow morning. I just want to say I learned a lot from your video. Well, you're most welcome. Glad to hear that. Let's see. Youssef, I'm going to ask a silly question. Oh, now I'm really curious. I am a computer science student, but I think I didn't take too much. And seeing the tech industry evolving so fast makes me afraid that I will be late. So what do I do? To be honest, I don't think you have to be that worried about it. I mean, it always looks like things are going ridiculously fast, which on some level they are. But, at the same time, there's still tons and tons of companies out there. Companies can't always change that fast. And there's always going to be work, especially if you're learning about computer science. It's still it's highly in demand. Even though we had, of course, layoffs lately from the tech industry. But computer scientists, IT people are always going to be wanted. And I wouldn't worry about being too late, because then basically everybody is too late. And if you are too late, you could always start a YouTube channel and talk about software design, which is what I did. Anyway, James, I love your content. Thanks, man. I'm a data scientist, and I have not heard your views on what makes a multidisciplinary team great. How can you get the best chance of scientists and engineers excelling together? So I've worked in the university with both researchers and engineers. I found it was pretty hard actually to get them to work together, because they have very different mindsets. Typically if I look in my companies with the teams we had always very different people, but then it was not so much the difference between, let's say, scientists and engineers. It was more about getting people from marketing and sales and software development and design working together. And there what I noticed is that it's really important to assign people clear responsibilities and make people responsible for a thing, instead of everybody having to work together on one thing and having to meet all the time to make some progress. So if you want people to excel, if you want a team to excel, give people separate responsibilities, make them responsible for a thing, and let them take their own decisions, and try to reduce the amount of times people have to meet. And this is actually something I'm still learning, because with the ArjanCodes channel, I'm also sort of struggling with that a bit. I mean, in the beginning, when I just launched the channel, I did basically everything myself, right? I wrote the scripts, I made the code examples, I did the video recording, I did the video editing, I posted the things on social media, I did the YouTube publication process, which can also get quite complicated. So I did everything, basically. And some things and that's, I think, also specific to my channel, are actually kind of hard to delegate. Like the code examples, for example. It's really hard to delegate that because they have a lot of my own ideas in them and the way that I tend to do things, and that's kind of what my channel is also built around. So if I completely hand off code example writing, that's going to be very hard. Now, I do work nowadays with a freelancer who helps me with some preparation work, which is incredibly helpful. It saves me a lot of time, but I still have to, go over those code examples and make sure that they fit with the way that I want to present it in a video. And then, of course, I have to do the actual recording. But also, for example, social media posts is actually pretty hard to hand that off completely, because it's not a YouTube channel for beginners. So the content that I post, it has to be in depth, it has to be valuable, and you can't just ask a random marketing person who has no technical background to do that for you. So I'm sort of struggling with how to distribute those responsibilities, but getting slowly better at that. Right, let's see. I have a few more questions, and then I'm going to call it a night, especially for the viewer from Taiwan, for whom it's already probably 4 a.m. or something, so we don't want to make it too late. So a few more questions. Unknown Stone Age Man, after years of coding, do you find yourself getting better at maths? Are you good at physics too? Yeah, so mathematics, I think that coding definitely helped me get better at that. Another thing that helped me get better at math is, for my company, having to do accounting, which, funnily enough, I actually like doing the accounting part of my company, the different styles of booking and making sure that the numbers match up. I think that's kind of fun. Probably few people will agree with me, but I do find that helps me get better at mathematics. Physics, not particular. I think that, maybe if you develop more simulation systems or things like that, then you will become better at physics. I did learn a lot about physics while I was doing research on computer animation, movement during my PhD, so that was kind of interesting. All right. So few last questions. Manu asks, my code is too coupled to the database submodule because I need data at several levels. I wish I could just query it at the start of main, but I can't have it in RAM for the whole run. Yeah, so I mean, that depends a bit on the type of data that you need, obviously, but if there is some way for you to split up that work, and often you can actually do that either by asking only the part of the data that you need at the point when you actually need it, Or you could batch things so that you're not processing everything all at once, but that you're actually doing it in batches, and then you don't need to store everything in RAM. You can just do it in small steps. Let's see. Jack, hi Arjan. What do you think the most exciting jobs in software development are right now? If you could give advice to your younger self, where would you try to steer him? So if I would tell my younger self what to do now, I would probably tell him to start a company sooner. I should have done it way sooner because it's really a lot of fun. I think there's really a lot of exciting things happening in software development. I think I would have liked to spend more time on the whole cryptocurrency end of things, and not so much building some sort of stupid token or something, but really dive more into the whole, let's say, Ethereum smart contracts area. I'm very interested in that, and I feel like I don't really have the time because of all the other things I'm doing to really dive into that, but I think that would be really cool to learn more about that and dive into that. And I think there's plenty of opportunities, even though there's, of course, lots of people who think either Bitcoin to the moon or it's a complete scam. I think actually the underlying technology is really helpful, and I would love to be a bit more part of that. York, thank you so much for your support. That's really kind. Thank you. Last question by Suyash. What is your opinion on AI replacing dev jobs? From what I've seen, they're good at generating snippets, but very poor at creating relational classes and designing applications. Yeah, so what I notice myself when I'm using these AI tools is that it's really extremely limited now. They're good at solving basic problems. They're good at copywriting. They're good at quickly completing a piece of code that you're working on. Specifically, Copilot, I use quite a lot for that. But as soon as things become more complicated, these systems typically fail. And it's also really hard to make them actually better at solving those complex problems, because for the complex problems, there's a lot less data you can find on the internet. So obviously the learning algorithms, the text generating algorithms, are going to be less good at generating text because there is less data. So that means that the harder problems are always going to be an issue. They're always going to be harder to solve. So I don't really see anything happening soon in the sense of that we're all going to lose our jobs or something. I mean, tools like ChatGPT, they're going to be integrated into different systems. We're already seeing that in a lot of places, and they're going to help us become more productive, just like other technological innovations did in the past. But I really don't believe in the coming years we have to be scared that we're all going to lose our jobs, because somebody still needs to decide the things. Somebody still needs to put that creative edge that AIs don't do. I mean, if you look at the text that ChatGPT generates, I've tried it to use it for like some scripting of my YouTube videos, and it's helpful. But if I would take, let's say, a script generated by ChatGPT and I would just speak the words, it would be a completely boring video, because ChatGPT generates text that's similar to everything else that's out there. So by using AI tools, you're actually removing creativity from the equation, because you're building on top of existing things. And I think there is still an edge that we as humans have in terms of creativity and being able to come up with new things, and not just things that are similar to the data that's already there. All right, I'm going to close for tonight. I want to thank you for watching, joining the live stream. It was really lovely to chat with you again. This Friday there's another video coming out about apps on my Mac that I use for software development. So think you might find that helpful. And finally, if you want to join the first group of people to become part of the software architecture course, just go to arjan.codes/architect, and I'll keep you updated on the progress of that course. So wish you a great evening or night if you are in Taiwan, or morning. I'm not sure how bad it is now. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.